Thank you, Jamie, and thank you for everyone. It's terrific to see so many colleagues, collaborators, friends, family here. And I'll try and be concise in this talk. Architecture at the building site. I'm going to start at the beginning, or at least with our first project. This house that James mentioned in Deptford. It's a house of two parts. It's a busy road that connects central London to the southeast, and to the street front there's a small building that became our practice and the base for our kind of fledgling practice as I set up, and to the rear a brownfield site that became the site for our new house. We bought the front site first, and then the second site beyond afterwards, and lived in the front site while we developed the rear site, and then on completing that, did the works to the front that became the office. Once upon a time, it was a workshop, light industrial warehouse, which had been incrementally changed, lost its roof and facade, but the rear and side walls of this retained. More recently, it had become a store space for a pub, kind of a yard, and in many ways, despite us carefully negotiating the purchase of it over kind of 7 years, in many ways it was not a particularly inspiring site, and yet short of money, we utilised what it had, which was this slab and this wall, and we built a new house within these existing walls. In this model, a certain surprising sense of proximity to the retaining surrounding walls. There's almost a sense of a matchbox dropped into this model, and yet on site these relationships were rather more precise. And so here in this plan, we see at the top the space we lived in during the works, visiting the buildings, looking out of our windows, seeing the construction as it happened, as builders came up with questions, responding to them in a very kind of direct way of them being able to knock on the door and ask what to do next while we kind of looked out on the building site. And then as that house to the rear was finished, we did those works. And you see here also the space between, in the centre, a courtyard, and these very narrow spaces adjacent to the house, with the house somehow suggesting that rather than a traditional house and garden, that these internal spaces and these external spaces might have a more intimate consideration. And in terms of that, the sense of a certain comparable quality to those internal and external spaces, such that one might meander through the site, the external spaces having a certain internal quality to them, and the internal spaces have a certain external quality. And I say we use the wall and the floor certainly through this kind of desire to be as cost conscious as we could. We designed this single-story timber construction, the lightness of the building, allowing us to cast a raft slab directly on top of the existing slab meaning we didn't have to break it out for foundations. There was no, not only the cost of the demolition, but also the environmental waste of it, the cost risk of it was kind of taken out of the project, and we were able to cast this raft straight onto the slab, and then the lightweight building sit onto that, which meant this fantastic first move of a construction project of erecting the side formwork to a new slab that defines the location of the house. And the house plan, it was very small, and we had 2 bedrooms in those top corners, with a large space below that had a fluid sense of eating, kitchen, living. But significantly, the kitchen here is back to back with the bathroom here and the utility room here, so that all of the services are central to the plan, and all of the waters and electricity line through this line and come in and out of the building at this point here. Meaning that, as well as not having to break out the slab for any additional foundations, we were able to do a single, simple trench from to connect the services into this central site point where all the services came in and out of the building, seen here. And onto that slab, onto that formwork was cast the slab, and then following on that, a kind of paint-on DPM. All of these works preceding the arrival from Switzerland of the cross-laminated timber panels, designed by ourselves in close collaboration with Urban, the technical company, and installed by them, delivered to site and craned over the wall. This top hat section that you saw in the section detail, allowing a certain working platform that they're able to do the higher works off, negating a need for additional scaffolding. And the panels, each with a small hole so that they can be, a strap goes through it and they're craned into place. And you see here this base detail where onto the slab a waterproofing strip is placed, and then firstly an H timber section which is fixed down into the slab, then a fillet into the top of that H section such that the groove on the underside of the slab is able to slot onto these base sections, allowing a degree of precision in the setting out through these lightweight elements, and then the heavyweight elements kind of fitting to that. And these drawings by Urban demonstrating, interestingly, the arrows indicate not the structural direction of span, because the cross-laminated timber panels work in both directions, but actually the grain of the outermost panel, and this sense of us working with a panel that has 2 directions of span, but wanting to communicate the load forces, the external, these vertical pieces having the grain going up and down, and then when we get to the roof, kind of the span going across as if it was a beam. And in our own plywood models that we constructed, a sense of developing a structural and a constructional understanding of this material, this timber panel with which operated structurally in both directions, and trying to understand how it related to other forms of construction and how it differed, and what the spatial consequences of these kind of structural particularities were. And so the cross-laminated timber arrived on site, and within a very short time, one got a sense of the conceptual basis of the project, of this house and this space that is somehow simultaneously defined by the structure and by the perimeter walls, the room ambiguously sometimes appearing to end at the structural point and sometimes at the outer wall. The site becomes the room. And remarkably, after 48 hours, their primary works were done. They stayed on site for the rest of the week doing kind of snagging and so on, but actually the house, as seen here, appeared within this very short period of 48 hours. And while this CLT package was developed with 21st century engineering and delivered from Switzerland, in parallel we worked with a joinery company in Nicaragua, Central America. And through connections, we knew people there, and a hurricane had knocked down a lot of very good quality timber that we were able to take advantage of, and the company was able to process this timber as FSC timber. It's fell timber. And we worked with these, I travelled over there, and we worked with these very traditional joiners using traditional joinery skills, and this beautiful hardwood. And that was brought to site, delivered through kind of shipping, and brought to site in these large sections such that the main contractor could assemble the glazing and the glass itself sandwiched between the two forms of timber, not held within the hardwood. You see on the left-hand side the kind of recess of the timber. And these follow-on activities and trades, the polished concrete floor that encompassed the underfloor heating, and a whitewash that allowed the grain of the timber to come through and be evident within the space, but somehow was recessive. And the finished building then, hidden behind the exterior wall from the streets behind, its crown somehow suggestive of a warehouse, perhaps. And within the wall, the building reveals the upstand to the ground slab that acts as a raft, and this lightweight fibre cement cladding that clads the CLT. And at moments, the space between the house and the wall has a certain intimacy, that the section's deliberately stepping down to enhance that. At moments, a remarkable sense of proximity, but still allowing fresh air and light into the house. And the interior somehow not too far from those trade activities we saw of the CLT, the hardwood that forms the windows, the built-in furniture, the polished concrete floor and the whitewashing, and to some extent that's these trades make up the internal spatial configuration. And then to the rear space, a series of more enfilade configuration with light carefully controlled through that sequencing of spaces. And at moments, the house in its material configuration doesn't feel too different from the house as built 48 hours after the arrival of the CLT on a flat slab. And the architecture always, every space in the house, the perimeter wall is present, becomes the container of the inhabitation of the site. And then in the second phase of the works, as we moved into the house, we developed the front part of the building, kind of playfully responding to the neighbour, and the office looking out onto that courtyard, into the house and through to the wall beyond as well, this kind of careful layering of spaces. It was a foundational project for the practice. It established key themes that we've pursued ever since. A certain hands-on ethos, focus on attention and care for detail, an interest in the relationship of inside and outside, internal space and external space that somehow seeks to step beyond a kind of a banal interpretation of that, and an interest in structure and the way that simultaneously structures inhabit a site, but also in turn are inhabited by joinery, by the use of the building, but also a sense of the idea that we've tried to continue since of precise and specific responses to context that somehow seek to combine a sense of radical reconfiguration of an existing site condition with a degree of delicate sensitivity. And I think that delicacy kind of going hand in hand with a kind of perhaps refined modesty. The project certainly sought, and much influenced by the work of Kenneth Frampton here, it sought to intertwine the technical and the cultural aspects of construction. But the manner in which the project was published in journals like Detail, a journal oriented towards construction, was problematic for me. The project was here reduced to an apparent direct correlation between precise architect's drawings and the completed building. In omitting the other people involved, the complex timelines at play, and the messy processes of site works, it rejected much that was fundamental to the project and much that was integral to the vitality and intensity of the architecture. It seemed to echo the 18th century French theorist Logier's comments on the vulgarity of the building site. The chaotic mess of clumsy debris, immense piles of shapeless materials, a dreadful noise of hammers, perilous scaffolding, a fearful grinding of machines, and an army of dirty and mud-covered workmen. Yet an engagement with this construction process, this chaotic mess, was exactly what I was looking for, an engagement with the production of architecture, with the materials and labour that go into the making of buildings. And so I developed the practice in a direction where design might be oriented towards the processes of building. So this next project is a small studio for art practice in a village in North Yorkshire. It was a outbuilding, once used for storage, but in a dilapidated state, the roof having collapsed. And quite early on, it became evident that we were going to develop this project with a pair of builders, a father and son, Fred and Simon, who lived in the next door village and were the obvious choice of builders. And the son was worked with timber, and the father worked with masonry. and we oriented the design of the building towards their skills and in the knowledge of who was going to build this. And it became thus a kind of a sense of the marriage of masonry and joinery or carpentry. But also we used a central concrete column to support the new roof beam partway through the span, the use of the timber being the moment these father and son came together and worked together on an element. So it's an outbuilding. This central column is formed to provide a series of uses, partly propping the roof mid-span, but also supporting a mezzanine at one part way up, and a certain relationship then between that mezzanine, part supported, and the new roof light facing north that provides a kind of even light for this art studio. And the building, on completion, very modest and apparently carefully repaired. The only significant difference for its external appearance, the scale of the north light that has a kind of surprising scale and quality to it. And then into this space, this discrete entrance, an interior defined by the work these two men did, the carpentry of the roof and the mezzanine, the joinery of this shelving, all of it done in Douglas fir and significant. You can't quite see it in the photographs, but the low-level works sanded and oiled, and the high-level works left rough. And even within this very small space, a secondary space beneath the mezzanine and another one above it. And the logic of the project of bringing these two men together, working discreetly on the two aspects of the project, and then working together on the concrete column, and the concrete column also spatially organising the interior of the building, almost maypole-like. The various components of the building are kind of dance around it, and the floor tiles rotate around it. And despite the small scale of the exterior of this building, through the scale of the roof light, the north light, and the height of the column, there's a surprising generosity to this modest building. And the work of the father in relation to this existing building, repairing the masonry. We gave it a whitewash at the end, or a lime wash, that speaks both of his care as a mason, but also of the earlier building. And the second project of the same period, outside Bristol, it was for a client, the Avon Wildlife Trust, and their project was, there was a wildlife reserve. This is the Avon River here. There was a wildlife reserve here that was extending into this strip of land, and as part of the project, they wanted to establish a seasonal shelter for volunteers and school groups and so on. And what was remarkable about the project for us was the extremely low budget, but also the extremely fast project. They wanted to complete this project in 4 weeks on site. And we considered how this remarkable program might be achieved, and came to this conclusion that we could buy an agricultural building and work with that. We could transform it and extend it. And so we worked with a company, Farm Plus, who are a standard supplier of agricultural buildings, and they provided their own drawings for this. And our plan added doors to this, added a kitchen and toilets, but also extended it with a canopy and certainly the architecture enjoying the mute quality of the farm building that became part of our architectural wider consideration, and enjoyment also of the distinct structural systems of the barn and the canopy. And so day one of the programme, the barn arrives on site, and these kind of standard components that they have, and 2 weeks later they have the simple agricultural building. Following on from this, we had 2 weeks where we had 2 Polish builders working intensely, transforming the interior of this building, but also extending it with a canopy. And it's the canopy that I want to focus on here. This canopy, to some extent, presenting a kind of a face for this as found building towards the landscape, but also a space that could be used out of season as a kind of sheltered space. And because of the speed of the project and the extraordinarily low budget of the project, we didn't have any scaffolding. So to build the canopy, we built it as a series of goalposts that were constructed on the ground with a vertical and 2 horizontals with a little bit of support between. And then each of these goalposts was constructed in turn and lifted into place, the lightness of them allowing the 2 builders to do it without any scaffolding, and the fact that we were able to then sequence each of them in turn created this doubling column where each of the goalposts joined the one before. And the final building then, with these galvanized steel doors onto the interior and the doubled form of the column that has a notch joint at the top where the connecting beam goes into, entirely defined not by a design aspiration but by the specifics of the constructional process that couldn't afford the scaffolding. And that decision relating then to the overall appearance, the certain delicacy of these 2 verticals, and how that then presented the agricultural building to the landscape. This internal space that could be used on rainy days by groups when the interior was locked, but also by the misalignment of the canopy with the shed acted as a certain gateway to the extended wildlife area. And significantly, my interest in these projects was not the alignment of architecture with a static abstraction of construction, nor a fictive image of construction. It was the specific skills of those involved and the actual processes at play that I wanted to lead the design. Intrinsic to this embrace of the realities of the building site was an embrace of a collaborative attitude that is hopefully inclusive and generous in character, perhaps akin to William Morris's idea of art as joy in collective labour. And what was achieved was a certain integrity to the architecture, a sense that the artefact might be understood as an index of its construction. Peter Smithson articulated something similar to this, noting, "For us, architecture which is palpably built is the most pleasurable of all, an architecture thought out in terms of its actual materials, its actual processes of fabrications, and its actual means of assembly. In such an architecture, one can sense an ordering from its sticks and stones." This appreciation of the palpably built and this attention to the skills on site perhaps inevitably led to questions of what is constructed on site and what is constructed before site works. and these in turn led to questions of economy. To realise projects in a cost-effective manner then, as well as eschewing profligacy and designing with a sense of leanness, the projects strategised the production processes involved in their formation. This next project is in Clapton. It's a small house. Kind of noteworthy, the standard London terrace of a deep plan and a narrow width, and actually this short terrace is very wide, double-fronted, and doesn't have much depth. And like these other projects I'm showing, we worked with Andy too from Price and Myers on this project, and we actually designed, got a fair bit along the design process when it became apparent through Andy's searches that there'd been one of the World War II flying bombs had landed nearby, and that the further end of the terrace had been demolished, and the other side had escaped damage, and this house was in between and actually had suffered some really significant damage but been kind of stuck together by plasters for the last 50 years, which resulted in this redesign, this sense that actually the building couldn't be maintained as it was, and what had been a small adaptation became a major transformation. The client keen to retain the front wall as some kind of placeholder of their existing mortgage, I think. And on the left, the existing section, and on the right, this new section, a simple extension outwards at the rear with a new roof, such that to the rear, this was actually, can be understood as a new house, and to the front as an existing house. And as part of that, this appreciation of the double frontage, such that we swapped over with the bedrooms and the bathrooms going to the ground floor, and a single open plan space to the upstairs now. And this transformation of a project from, in scale, from something that was meant to be much smaller, and the client's hand was forced on this new scale of it, brought this, once more, these economic pressures on the job. And interestingly, the main contractor assured us that they could produce their own roof trusses at a competitive price. But what became apparent is they couldn't, that actually the kind of commonly bought standard trusses produced in a kind of mass-produced manner actually had a remarkable cheapness to them that could play a really key role in achieving the ends of this expanded project. And it meant that rather than designing the truss per se, there's a certain sense of accepting certain details that came as standard, and accepting a certain roughness that came with that, the metal plates, the red letters and so on. But still a degree of design on ours and Price and Myers' part, a sense of, well, we can have slightly larger truss sections and less of them, or as we ended up choosing slightly smaller and more of them, that gives a certain filigree to the roof. And while this provided the new shell of the building, the money that we saved on that was spent at low level, and we spent it with tri-board, a kind of type of timber construction somewhere between ply and CLT, and this was all produced by a joiner, and it was produced on site in a bespoke manner, fitted to the particular dimensions of the space, and a certain material cost to that beyond the roof, but also care to the production of it. And the finished house then apparently new to the rear, with this upper space that acts as a kitchen, living, dining room, a kind of warehouse type space that evidences the two attitudes to timber construction, with the roof sitting on a kind of supporting beam that braces the old front wall, and at the rear a certain thickening of the linings to accommodate a window seat. But certainly this stratification of the construction, where the top was built as cheap as possible, there was a deliberate enjoyment of the off-the-shelf elements, a deliberate enjoyment of the roughness of these details that was seen to contrast with the greater cost of the timber at lower level that formed a lining to the interior, completely encompassing 3 walls of the space, and including various elements of built-in furniture, and a differentiation partly in terms of the cost and the bespokeness or not of these two types of timber construction, but also an interest in the way that the linings were formed from a planar material and the roof construction from a linear material. And on top of that, an enjoyment that by articulating the interior through this relationship of the two timber construction methodologies, we could somehow also relate the works to the existing building without it becoming too binary in its sense of old and new, that actually the interior was articulated in more in a richer way, I think, of different forms of new and different forms of old. Which brings us on to drawing matter in Somerset, a remarkable conjunction of a cultural brief within an agricultural setting that at one time was a farmhouse without buildings, and this larger T-shaped building becoming 2 buildings with the demolition of this and 2 buildings to the sides. Stephen Taylor's barn in the rear there, and we see the kind of dilapidated state that this long, thin building had got, largely through lack of care, but through its sense of being on the edge of the valley where the water came down and kind of formed this kind of damp wall that was kind of an ongoing problem. And because it was listed by curtilage with that main house, we weren't able to demolish all of the building, and yet the existing building was deeply problematic, and we came to a compromise situation with the planners where we retained some of the walls and lost the roof and other walls, and developed these 2 timber buildings, one holding the collection and one operating as a studio, and cleared the site of the old building except for the front and the side walls, but also cut back a section of the turning of the valley, preventing the water from coming into the building in the way it formerly had. And onto this, 2 slabs to support the building, and a retaining wall to the rear that also in turn makes a long, thin space to the rear of the buildings. And these works formed in concrete. We were keen to construct these works in an expedient manner, and wanted, in a knowledge of some of the other things we were doing, wanted a certain roughness to them. And we talked about various ways of achieving this roughness, and it was interesting how buildings like the one we're in at the moment sometimes achieve roughness through additional cost and additional treatments or activities, bush hammering and so on. We didn't want to do that. We achieved a roughness here through saving money, through extra use of the formwork, that it was these plywood was used beyond its normal usage, so that actually over time, as they kind of carried on the work, there was an inherent roughness to it. And in contrast, certain elements were formed in the next door barn using phenolic ply as a formwork that produced these very precisely made concrete elements that were inserted in the concrete base structure to form a bench and steps. And together, these concrete works, which allow the route through, a step up, a bench, a space at the end, present a kind of reconfigured landscape, and somehow a kind of expectant or an anticipatory topography, onto which, once again, we've worked with CLT, and the CLT is delivered from Central Europe and brought to site. And the CLT sitting behind the existing walls and the retaining wall over there, monolithic, with on the walls and the roof no insulation, but the oversailing roof with large eaves protecting the edges of it. And working again with urban, these hugely thick walls, and particularly the roof, sized in relation to the thermal performance, the U value they were achieving, with the CLT operating both as insulant and as thermal mass. And in a relation to the Strange house at the beginning, with the greater weight, there's a kind of requirement for greater precision also, in that there's no follow-on trade to seal things up. And so here there's a base detail with these very thin aluminium T-sections, which the panels slot onto with thin grooves on their underside. And when two panels sit one above the other, there are grooves in each of them with thin aluminium sections, and you see also the kind of black rubber that provides an airtight seal. And a desire to think through the constructional consequences of this method of building, to think through how, for instance, one might make windows and doors, and whilst one can cut into a panel and have an aperture within a panel, we were interested in the kind of efficiency of forming windows and doors through the gaps between panels, which in turn becomes suggestive of earlier forms of construction of posts and beams, and provides a very distinct quality to the interiors of these datums that run alongside the windows and door lines. And because the timbers are sized not for structure but for thermal performance, there was an ability to span the roof lengthwise rather than shortwise, doing away with any sense of needing a downstand at the top or similar. And the roof lights, which operated in this 400mm deep monolithic wall, are deliberately chamfered, allowing a kind of accentuated thickness, but also a kind of softening of the light into the space. And while this, once again, was a kind of 21st century engineered technology, we worked with a local joiner from the next door village who, using timber that had been stored on site from the surrounding woodlands, built these beautiful timber floors using traditional joinery skills. And we worked with a upholsterer to make a series of panels which used packing blankets as their outer material, mounted on these thin timber boards with horsehair in between. The idea being that the cost of the panel was spent on the labour rather than the material, that actually the care that and time was taken was somehow had an exchange of the cost of the material, which in use became something that could support the preparation of an exhibition or the presentation of drawings in a symposium. And because the CLT had to be protected from the rain, we face-fixed windows and doors onto the outside. Indeed, this became a kind of constructional logic for the monolithic walls altogether, that actually things were fitted to the outside and the inside to it without cutting into them. And because of this, this third set of materials and building components came to play, this sense of materials and components that were mass-produced and used either at the top as gutter pieces or roofing panels in their kind of expected way, or at the bottom with the use of these agricultural pig slats as paving in an unexpected way. But the enjoyment on our part of the building being made up of mass-produced elements, of bespoke factory elements, and then these carefully crafted elements, which were sometimes very traditional crafts. And the finished building nestling in the farmyard, but also nestling behind the wall, whilst to the rear it presents its full identity. And inside, the space illuminated from the roof light at the top with the contrast of this kind of carefully made floor with the spruce of the CLT. And interestingly, this constructional system somehow having a particular relevance, it would seem, to this juxtaposition of the brief and the site, that as a 21st century construction technology, it was able in its thickness to moderate thermal change through its thickness, but also through its kind of hygroscopic qualities, it was able to moderate moisture. And yet, it also had a directness to the simplicity of construction of the farm buildings, that actually this simple monolithic construction somehow talked to the surrounding directness. This wish to consider an economy of means through strategizing and expedient consideration of production processes resulted then in a hybrid approach encompassing forms of mass production, bespoke factory production, the crafts and the trades, in both conjunction and deliberate juxtaposition. The strategies had an economic logic and an appreciation that to some extent this was how the world of construction operated anyway, but that fully recognising that and integrating it into the design process brought one as a designer closer to the project's realisation. In this, the strategists seek to carefully balance the prefabricated and the contingent, the skilled and the unskilled, the costly and the cheap. Importantly, the consideration of these processes also offered visual and tactile architectural opportunities. In an architecture preoccupied with a sensitivity to material, the different skills and tools involved in these various production processes offered a palette of the refined and the rugged, the rough-textured and the smooth, the uniformity of the machine, and the varied mark of the hand. These explorations of works that happen on site and works that happen before site, while perhaps suggesting a preoccupation with the project's own internal resolution, also problematize how the variety of processes can be brought into meaningful relationship with the site itself, how they might indeed contribute to a precise response to the pre-existing. So moving on to more recent projects. This is the last project we've completed, and it's in Hastings. It's a residential project on one of the steeply sloping sites that rise up away from the centre of the town. This existing section showing this kind of remarkable steepness of the site. This is actually the rear garden, and you see that by the time you get to the top of the site, you're actually at a higher level than the upper floors of the house. And it was in a poor state when we came. There was a main house, but there was a 1980s extension that turned its back on the garden, and the garden was, or this, I shouldn't really call it a garden, this space was seen as an inconvenience. But it was also failing in many ways. It was a series of concrete terraces that were riddled with cracks and structural failure. And so we set about repairing this. We spoke with the client, with the engineer. We decided, all of us, that we didn't want to demolish this topography and make it anew. That actually the financial and environmental costs involved were just too great, and instead set about a form of careful repair that in some ways was preconsidered, elements understood where an existing concrete wall might be retained and repaired, elements where an existing concrete wall might need to be remade, elements where blockwork could be used. But also in this kind of very site-specific and precise model of repair, there was a sense of having to operate in a contingent manner as well. And the first operation being the boring of these deep holes that you see here, into which a series of plugs are drilled such that they retain with these patras plates the existing retaining walls, or they reinforce the existing retaining walls, together with the texture of the existing walls and these new walls, this creating a certain appearance to the repaired wall that's part design certainly, but the aesthetic a consequence of the expedient nature of the repairs. And during those repair works, as a piece is made, for instance, this bottom concrete section that had to be a wall that had fallen down that had to be remade, as part of those repair works, the route through and up the site reconfigured and reconsidered. And so the plan on the left, the existing, and on the right, the proposed, in part turning its back on this difficult space, but also a series of spaces that are disconnected from the garden and disconnected from each other. And in place, we developed the interior of the house with a new gallery extension with a kitchen and a dining room and a gallery that operates in part as a single room and in part as 3 rooms, defined by the size of these apertures, with a living room and a study. And these new parts extending up the repaired hillside, and realised in timber construction, in LVL construction, lumber veneer laminate, through this series of timber structures that step up the hillside, and as they step in parallel, a new route through the site, partly through existing elements, partly through new cast-in elements, and partly through new steel additional elements. And working with Andy, our engineer, and conversationally working backwards and forwards, our kind of our understanding of how one might construct with the LVL, in part a desire on our part, mirrored by Andy, to reject the sense of joints being formed through the metalwork that fixes, which is often the case where these timbers are kind of come up against each other and there's a gap, and the gap is filled by a bit of metal that works. And instead a desire to form a junction through a post that supports a beam and a beam that's notched to support another beam. And in turn, the conversation of how that simple logic of construction might be developed to relate to an LVL construction that, through its very thinness, becomes paired, which in turn becomes a post where the central section slips up in between the 2 panels here, and then this beam here sits on the notch of this other beam. And this sense of a kind of constructional junction resulting in a hierarchy of the apertures, that this window is higher than this window, which in turn, that hierarchy of how glazing might turn a corner responds to the broader organizational structure of the spaces and of the design, that the larger windows open onto the main space, smaller windows to secondary directions. And in the final building as it's clad, that step being legible in the glaze, in the metalwork detail that steps up, so the higher window at this point with a metal brow that shelters the large opening doors. So a certain integral understanding between a desire for detail that had a palpable sense of support, how that related to a contemporary technology of LVL, and how that might respond in turn to a broader spatial and formal considerations. Interestingly, the LVL here completed on site, designed by in collaboration with a kind of specialist subcontractor who was supposed to install it. As it turned out, they had too much work on when their moment came to install it, and rather than wait for them, the client took the project out of their hands and installed it himself with the main contractor working alongside them. This simple sense of construction joints somehow successfully playing through to this amended mode of procurement and who does what. And in the finished building, this opened up interior with the new works in timber beyond, a certain layering of spaces once more, an enjoyment of that layering with the repaired wall at the rear, and a certain conjunction or juxtaposition between the new elements and the repaired elements. And alongside these new elements, this route that takes one up the hillside, past the study, through elements that are part existing, part repaired. By the time we got to this point in the project, the client had gained a certain confidence, and we'd gained a confidence with them that they could adapt things on site, that they'd learnt the rules of the game, and said to me, Hugh, I think I get it. As long as we do it in these materials, I think it's going to work, isn't it? And we carefully wove this new route, part through our design, part through their intuitive responses, weaving up to the top of the hillside, which looks back over the site. And in the centre then, this moment where the building's stepping up the side on one side and the new route weaving up the other side, a central space that orientates the house towards the outside, and onto which these large sliding windows always facing, so that the different spaces all look out and open out onto the central spaces, and this cap very much oriented towards that idea of a large sliding door being able to protect the interior from the sun, from the rain. And this sketch suggesting those kind of those primary windows that are all sliding, all relating to structure, and all oriented towards this central space, holding it with the repaired works forming a backdrop to that central space. And onto this final project in Cornwall, near the Atlantic coast, and on an estate in a farming landscape, gently rolling, and the key buildings here being, this is the access route, and this leads all the way to the manor house of the estate at the end, and past the cattle shed with our new project associated with it. And the architecture of the old manor house that had developed from the 15th century onwards, with constant iterations, adjustments, but certainly equipped to withstand the wild climate they have down there. Whereas the cowshed was a more recent construct from the last 10 years, and housed the kind of the herd over time. And our project was for a farm manager, for someone who could manage the agricultural activity of the estate and live in enough proximity to the herd to care for it, but distance enough that it wasn't too intrusive. And evident in this construction photo, this kind of proximity to the Atlantic coast, where these wild winds come in, and hence these kind of remarkable trees you see in the landscape. It's kind of almost horizontal in their growth structure. And the house very much relating both in use but also in orientation to the existing barn, nestled in the bottom corner of the field, but quite deliberately aligned in its orientation, that it faces on towards the barn, creates a very deliberate space between the two, but also as an L-shaped building, creates a private space to the rear, such that the existing field can run up to the walls of the house. The sense that the house might step away from domesticating this kind of agricultural landscape, and the domestic realm is instead contained within this wall of the courtyard house, and somehow instead the agricultural land being able to surround and run right up to the house. And in plan, it's a courtyard house that relates certainly to more recent typologies of Utzon or Alto or so on in its planning, but also relates to a kind of tradition of moorland courtyard houses. And in being single story, it has two wings, one a living wing and one a bedroom wing, with an entrance at the knuckle, and quite deliberately an office for the farm worker that is adjacent to the entrance and looks out towards the herd, whereas the rest of the house is oriented towards the private domestic realm rather than to the wider landscape. And the building, whilst considered in relation to the existing barn, was built in masonry, while the barn is a steel structure, a thin steel structure. This is a thick-walled masonry structure, the new building, built with hollow clay blocks that were imported from Germany. These blocks of a thickness with these air pockets in them that allowed them to operate as insulation, so that no additional layers were required, which meant that we could cut them to chamfer walls. And here, one of the north-facing walls, which presents a solid protective face to the winds, to the coastal winds, whereas towards the courtyard there's a more porous consideration of opening and aperture. And at the end, or almost end, of these masonry works, a simple perimeter with a protected space to the rear, which was followed on by a timber roof with Douglas fir, British-grown Douglas fir, produced by a terrific localish company, Timber Workshop, and this constructs a kind of relationship between the sticks and the masonry that this drawing makes evident, both the play of the typology, but also the continuous nature of this timber roof that brings the various rooms of the house into a whole. And the wall plate fixed down with these brackets, the top bit left exposed in its final form, and doubling up as a lintel over the windows, with the details of these walls. On the left, a solid wall, remarkably simple, just a single leaf of thick masonry with lime render on the outside and lime plaster on the inside. And then when the opening comes, the wall plate here becomes a lintel. And this model somehow exploring for us that relationship of formal typology with the wall and the frame. And a lot of the local buildings have this very textured, or the local agricultural buildings have this very textured finish that I was very interested in. They call it Dobbin down there. And while we started wanting to work with this, actually it turned out it was both something that had lost its usage, that there weren't people who could do it anymore, but it also turned out that actually it was a 20th century skill that was very problematic and detrimental to these older buildings. That what would happen is there would be an older stone building that would be repaired and coated with this concrete-based cementitious render that stopped the building breathing, which kind of created all these kind of cracking problems that came on. And so this sense of this kind of problematic tradition that was nevertheless provocative in its textural use. And we understood, however, that through using a textured lime render, we could make the wall perform better. That actually the texture allowed a kind of greater surface area, greater sense of control of the moisture, but also had this kind of very interesting handmade aspect to it, with the finished wall at moments extremely textured and with a reveal more refined, and giving the overall building this kind of gentle variation of tone and colour that is deliberately contrasted with the machine-made profiled galvanised steel sheet roof that stops it becoming too crafted, while the wall stops the roof, making the building too cold. And the space between the two buildings, this land, we dug a series of trenches which ground source heat pump, ground source coils were put in that feed a heat pump that in turn is transferred to underfloor pipes in the building. This interesting sense of a simple strategy of heating where the heat is taken from the ground in the field and transferred to the ground in the building, once more kind of reinforcing this relationship of building to land. And in turn also a strategy of services where certain elements are more serviced than others. These elements of highly serviced parts of the building, these elements of lesser serviced parts, these being the kind of bathrooms and utility rooms and bedrooms and so on, which in turn led to a construction strategy where the perimeter walls are built in masonry, and all the internal walls of those highly serviced areas are built in stud-work, and all the electricity and cabling runs through the stud-work and is kept away from the masonry walls, so that in the finished building there are electrical elements in these stud-work walls, and there are skirtings to them as kind of finished pieces of walling, whereas the thick outer walls retain their monolithic simplicity with no services cut into them, no skirtings. And the finished building, nestled into that back corner of the field, and because it's single story with this at the kind of upper end of the field with this pitched roof, it's below the tree line, nestling. At moments, this very reduced scale of architecture at the entrance point. And as kind of said before, the ability, because of this defined domestic territory of the courtyard, for the field to go right up to the building. Whereas to the rear of the building, the courtyard becomes a defined space, the outside right up to it, and a more open architecture looking onto the domestic space of herb gardens and children's activities and clothes drying and so on. And utilising the gentle topography of the site, such that the steps from the hall down into the main space allow a scale to that wing of the building and an intimacy to the bedroom wing. And the finished building then, with that large space beyond, which has a greater scale and is somehow a simple monolithic form of construction that allows a relatively unserviced interior. And this construction photograph after the masonry and after the roof suggests an idea, I think, then, that this building, in its consideration of time, in its control of construction and its strategizing of services, suggests that actually there might be a life for the building that might be 100, 200, 300 years, maybe more, this kind of simple form. Whereas this elements of the stud work and the electrics have a kind of different timeline. They might be much shorter. They might be 20, 30, 40, 50 years. But actually the building might be reconfigured. It might once more become a building site. The one use of it removed and rethought. The site made building site anew. And these ideas of time in construction, of time constructing before and during site operations, of interrelated design and construction time, and the immediacy attained, also relates then to a longer sense of the time of the site. All of these projects represent previously occupied sites. They're developed in relation to the existing fabric of an earlier building already on the site. And the recognition of the prehistory of the site as a former building site is mirrored here by the future projection of the project through anticipated adaptation and reuse as a building site of the future. These projects then seek a reciprocity of design and construction, and they reject any notion of the building site as a place of mere building. William Letherby proposed within the arts and crafts milieu that, quote, "The art of architecture is thus the coordination of the several crafts in the achievement of right and beautiful building. And this not only in the outer form and adornment, but in the very structure and anatomy. Architecture is the easy and expressive handling of materials in masterly experimental building. It is the craftsman's drama." In these strategies these projects adopt, I would suggest they represent a development of Letherby's position, a development that includes but extends beyond craft, that I might characterize as a choreography of production processes on site and in relation to the site. And within this choreographic enterprise, in recognizing the essentially dynamic character of both design and construction, the work suggests that design might emerge from the process of construction. Thank you.